The front door didn't just open, it bled cold air into the foyer. My mother didn't greet me. She looked past my shoulder, checking if the neighbors were watching me walk up the driveway before she stepped back to let me in. "You're late," she said. Her voice lacked its usual performative warmth. "Your sister has been helping me since 7 this morning." "The traffic on the interstate was backed up," I said, setting my coat on the banister. "Naturally." She walked away, her low heels clicking against the hardwood. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the familiar, suffocating weight of my childhood home settle over my chest. I had spent 3 years keeping a deliberate distance, building a life 3 states over, but the moment you cross this threshold, time folds in on itself. You are immediately cast back into the role they assigned you. In our family, Clara was the fragile masterpiece. I was the sturdy crate she arrived in. When I walked into the kitchen, Clara was sitting at the island holding a mug of cider with both hands. She looked pale, her shoulders curved inward, the picture of elegant exhaustion. Our father was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a look of intense, protective misery. "Hi, everyone," I said, trying to inject some normal rhythm into the room. Clara looked up, her eyes wide and watery. She didn't say hello. Instead, she let out a small, trembling breath and looked down at her mug. "My father didn't move. We didn't think you'd show up, Maya." "Why wouldn't I show up? It's Thanksgiving." "After what you did." My mother turned around from the stove, her face tight. "The sheer nerve it takes for you to look your sister in the eye right now is beyond me." I froze. The kitchen grew incredibly quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. "What are you talking about?" "Don't do that," my father said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "Don't play the innocent. Clara told us everything last week. She didn't want to ruin the holidays, she wanted to protect you, but I forced it out of her. We know about the account." I looked at Clara. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She was staring intently at a small knot in the wood of the island. "What account?" I asked, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "The joint savings your grandmother set up for her," my mother spat, her fingers trembling as she pointed a wooden spoon at me. "The $70,000 meant for her medical emergency fund and her master's program. It's gone, Maya. The bank told her the balance was cleared out 3 weeks ago, via electronic transfer, to an account registered in your name." The absurdity of the statement was so vast that for a second I almost laughed. "That's impossible. I don't even have access to Clara's accounts. I haven't since we were teenagers." "The paper trail doesn't lie," my father said. He stepped forward, towering over me, using the physical intimidation he'd relied on since I was a child. "Clara went to pull tuition money and found a zero balance. She called the fraud department. They traced the routing number straight to your digital wallet. You took everything she had to fund that boutique marketing agency of yours, didn't you? You couldn't handle that she was the one who stayed close, the one who actually cared about this family, so you decided to ruin her." "I didn't touch her money," I shouted, the defense tearing out of my throat before I could stop it. "Clara, tell them, look at me and tell them I didn't take your money." Clara finally looked up, a single tear tracked down her cheek, perfectly timed. "Maya, just admit it. If you needed help with your business, you could have asked to steal it behind my back while I'm trying to pay off my medical debt. How could you hate me that much?" The room spun. The sheer scale of the lie was breathtaking. I looked at my mother's face, twisted in disgust, my father's rigid with righteous fury, and Clara's a mask of victimhood she had perfected over 25 years. I realized then that they didn't want an explanation. They wanted a villain, and I had always been their favorite candidate. "I'm leaving," I whispered. "Oh, you're not going anywhere," my father said, his voice low and steady. "The rest of the family is coming in an hour, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins. We are going to sit down, we are going to eat, and then you are going to sign a promissory note transferring the equity of your firm over to your sister. If you don't, I'm calling the police before the pumpkin pie hits the table. You will not humiliate this family by running away. You think I'm going to stay here and let you accuse me of a felony?" "It's not an accusation if we have the proof," my mother said coldly. "Go wash your hands. Your Aunt Sarah just pulled into the driveway." I stood there, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and utterly isolated in the house I grew up in. I looked at the digital clock above the stove. It was 1:15 p.m. Instead of screaming, instead of crying, a strange, icy calm descended over me. I felt the panic recede, replaced by a sharp, crystalline clarity. I knew exactly what my sister was capable of, and for the first time in my life, I realized I had to stop defending myself to people who desperately wanted me to be guilty. "Fine," I said softly, "I'll stay for dinner." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My aunts, uncles, and cousins arrived in a flurry of coats and loud greetings, but the atmosphere in the house was instantly infectious. My parents didn't pull people into corners to whisper, they used a much more devastating tactic. They dropped hints. "Oh, Clara's doing as well as can be expected," I heard my mother tell Aunt Sarah in the living room while I was setting out the water glasses. "It's just been a terrible shock, someone she trusted completely. Well, we're trying to handle it as a family, but the financial strain is immense." Then came the looks. My cousin Julian, who used to text me every week, wouldn't make eye contact when I passed him the rolls. Uncle David gave me a long, disappointed stare from across the room, shaking his head slightly before turning back to the television. They were poisoning the well bucket by bucket, ensuring that by the time we sat down to eat, I would be completely radioactive. I stayed in the dining room, systematically aligning the silverware, checking the plates, doing anything to keep my hands moving. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Robert. "I'm 5 minutes away. Do you want me to park down the street or in the driveway?" "Driveway asterisk," I typed back, and Robert. "Bring the black briefcase from the trunk. Don't leave it in the car." "Understood. See you in a minute." Robert wasn't just my attorney, he was my closest friend from college. He had spent the last 4 years building a boutique white-collar defense practice, and more importantly, he knew every single detail of my financial life because he had helped me structure my agency. When I had called him from the gas station 3 hours ago, frantic and hyperventilating, he hadn't asked questions. He had simply told me to stay calm and let him pull the records. When the doorbell rang, my mother went to answer it, expecting perhaps another cousin. Instead, she found Robert standing on the porch in a tailored wool coat, holding a heavy leather briefcase. "Robert," she said, her voice dropping an octave into her formal host mode register, "we weren't expecting you. Maya didn't mention she'd invited a guest." "Mrs. Vance," Robert said, stepping inside with an easy professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Apologies for the intrusion. Maya asked me to drop off some urgent paperwork regarding her business. I won't stay long, but it couldn't wait." My father emerged from the living room, his brow furrowed. "Paperwork today?" "It's a time-sensitive matter, Mr. Vance," Robert said smoothly, taking off his gloves. "I'm sure you understand how volatile the market can be." "Actually, Richard," my mother said, a sharp gleam entering her eye as she looked from Robert to me, "why don't we invite Robert to sit down with us? We were just about to serve. It seems appropriate that Maya's legal representation is present for the discussion we're having after dinner." She thought she was trapping me. She thought that by bringing my lawyer into the house, she could fast-track the coercion, forcing me to sign away my company under the threat of immediate public ruin. "I wouldn't want to intrude," Robert said, looking at me for the cue. "Please, Robert," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Sit. I think you'll find the conversation very interesting." The dining room table was set for 12. The turkey sat in the center, golden and steaming, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, stuffing, and cranberries. It looked like a photograph from a magazine, the quintessential image of American family harmony. But the silence around the table was thick enough to choke on. Nobody passed the food with any enthusiasm. The only sounds were the scraping of serving spoons and my father clearing his throat at the head of the table. Clara sat directly opposite me, her head bowed, picking at a piece of turkey like it was a chore. My mother sat to her right, occasionally reaching over to pat her hand in an overt display of public mourning. Robert sat next to me, his briefcase resting flat on the floor between his feet. He ate calmly, making polite, superficial small talk with Aunt Sarah about the weather, completely unaffected by the radioactive tension in the room. "So Maya," Uncle David said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He couldn't help himself. The family gossip machine had been primed too well. "Your mother mentions things are going exceptionally well with your firm, expanding rapidly apparently." The table went completely still. Even the kids stopped chewing. "We're doing well, Uncle David," I said, taking a sip of water. "We just picked up 2 new regional accounts." "Must take a lot of capital to expand like that," my father said from the head of the table. He didn't look at his plate, he looked directly at me. "A lot of cash flow, more than a young person could typically raise on their own without alternative sources of funding." "Richard," my mother said, her voice laced with a fake warning softness. "Not yet." "No, Elena, I think now is exactly the right time," my father said, slamming his hand down on the table. The water glasses rattled. "I'm looking across this table at one daughter who worked 2 jobs while dealing with a chronic illness to save every dime she had, and another daughter who thinks she can come into this house, eat our food, and pretend she didn't commit a crime against her own flesh and blood." Aunt Sarah gasped. Cousin Julian looked down at his plate. Clara let out a small, pathetic sob and covered her face with her hands. "Richard, please," Clara whimpered. "Don't do this here." "No, Clara, it's going to be done here," my father roared. "I want everyone to know exactly what kind of person we are harboring." Maya took $70,000 from Clara's account 3 weeks ago. She used her position as an authorized user from 10 years ago, an account we forgot to take her name off of, and she drained it. She stole her sister's future. Every eye at the table turned to me. Some were filled with horror, others with a twisted kind of satisfaction. They had always suspected I was the selfish one, the arrogant one who left town to make something of herself while Clara stayed behind to be the perfect daughter. Now they had their proof. I didn't blink, I didn't cry, I looked at Robert. Robert finished chewing, dabbed his mouth with his napkin and reached down. He lifted the heavy black briefcase, placed it squarely on the table, right next to the gravy boat, and popped the latches. The sound of the metallic clicks echoed through the silent room like a pair of gunshots. The silence in the room solidified into something absolute. Nobody moved. My mother's hand remained suspended in the air, inches from Clara's shoulder. My father leaned forward, his chest pressed against the edge of the table, his eyes drilling into Robert. Robert didn't look like a man at a Thanksgiving dinner anymore. The easy, polite guest had vanished, replaced entirely by the sharp, unyielding strategist who had cleared out corporate boardrooms. He opened the lid of the briefcase, reached inside, and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Mr. Vance," Robert said, his voice dropping into a calm, resonant register that effortlessly commanded the room, "you mentioned a paper trail. As Maya's legal counsel, I agree that documentation is paramount. However, the problem with digital trails is that people often stop looking the moment they find the name they want to see." He opened the folder and drew out 3 identical, stapled stacks of paper. Each page bore the official watermarked emblem of a major national bank, complete with certified red stamps across the header. "These," Robert said, sliding the first stack down the center of the table until it rested directly against my father's water glass, "are the certified, unedited forensic bank statements for the account in question, the joint savings account ending in 4409. My father didn't touch them at first. He stared at the papers as if they were a trap. "I told you, we already know what they say." The money was transferred to an account registered to Maya's marketing firm. "Let's look closer at that transfer, shall we?" Robert leaned back, crossing his legs, his posture completely relaxed. 3 weeks ago, on November 2nd, a digital transfer of $70,000 was indeed initiated from that account. It was routed through an online payment portal. But if you look at page 3, line 14, you will see the hardware identification tag, the MAC address and IP location of the device that authorized that transfer. Robert tapped the table. The transfer did not originate from Maya's office in Chicago. It didn't originate from her phone. The IP address traces directly to a residential router located at 142 Elm Street, which, if I am not mistaken, is the address we are currently sitting in. A sharp, collective intake of breath rippled down the table. Aunt Sarah looked at my mother looked at my father. "That's nonsense," my father muttered, though his hand finally reached out and grabbed the papers. He flipped through them, his eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers. "She could have spoofed it. She's tech-savvy. She could have done it from afar." "A valid hypothesis," Robert countered smoothly, "except for the destination account. The funds weren't sent to Maya's active corporate checking. They were sent to a secondary, dormant LLC account that Maya opened 5 years ago and never used, an account that Clara was added to as a secondary signatory during their college years so she could help manage shared apartment expenses, an account Maya hasn't logged into since 2023. I looked across the table at Clara. The carefully cultivated mask of the tragic victim was starting to fracture. The color had completely drained from her lips, and her fingers were tightly gripping the edge of her napkin under the table, her knuckles white. "What are you implying?" my mother asked, her voice rising in defensive anger. "Are you saying our daughter robbed herself?" "Not quite, Mrs. Vance," Robert said. He reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a second set of documents, bound in blue legal backing. $70,000 entered that dormant account on November 2nd. On November 3rd, less than 24 hours later, the entire balance was moved again. This time, it wasn't an electronic transfer. It was a certified cashier's check, drawn from a branch right down the street on Highway 9. Robert looked directly at Clara. "A cashier's check requires a physical signature and a government-issued ID. I have the bank's internal security log right here, including the scanned copy of the identification presented to the teller." He slid the blue-bound document across the table. It landed directly in front of Clara. On the top page was a high-resolution black-and-white photocopy of a driver's license. The face staring back from the paper wasn't mine, it was Clara's. Beneath it was a copy of the cashier's check, signed in her distinct, looping handwriting, made out entirely to a corporate entity called *Vanguard Political Consulting *. Clara, Aunt Sarah whispered, her voice cracking the heavy silence. "What is that?" Clara didn't answer. She sat frozen, staring at her own face on the paper as if it were a ghost. "This brings us to the second part of the ledger," I said, speaking up for the first time. My voice was steady, devoid of the anger that had consumed me hours ago. "The part where we talk about why Clara needed $70,000 so desperately that she had to stage a family execution to cover it up." My father looked up from the papers, his face a map of confusion and growing horror. He looked at Clara, then at the check, then back to Robert. "Political consulting? Clara isn't involved in politics, she's an administrative assistant at the clinic." "She was," I corrected, "until 3 months ago when she decided to quietly launch a primary campaign for the upcoming county commissioner seat. Isn't that right, Clara?" The table erupted into low, frantic whispering. My cousins were leaning over each other to catch a glimpse of the documents. My mother looked entirely unmoored, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. "She didn't tell you," I continued, looking at my parents, "because she knew you would tell her it was too risky, that she didn't have the stamina, that she shouldn't risk her stable job. But Clara didn't want to be the fragile one anymore. She wanted power. She wanted to prove she could build something bigger than my agency. The problem is political campaigns are incredibly expensive, and the filing fees, staff retainers, and media buys require immediate cash up front." "You took your own grandmother's inheritance money?" my father asked, his voice shaking, dropping the booming anger for something much more fragile. He turned his head slowly to look at his favorite daughter. "The money we kept safe for your treatments." "Your master's degree." "It wasn't enough," Clara suddenly burst out, her voice cracking, dropping the tears entirely. She slammed her hands on the table, her face twisting into an expression I had never seen on her before, a mixture of profound resentment and desperate defiance. "The campaign manager told me I needed a $70,000 cash reserve to even be taken seriously by the state committee. I was going to pay it back. Once the fundraising dinners started next month, I was going to put every single dollar back into the account before anyone noticed." "Then why frame Maya?" Aunt Sarah asked, horrified. Clara looked at me, her eyes filled with a raw, burning animosity that had clearly been festering for years. "Because the state committee did a preliminary background check last week. They told me that if I had an unexplained $70,000 withdrawal right before launching a campaign, it would look like a personal liability or a gambling debt if the press found out. They said I needed a clean narrative." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "So I gave them one, a narrative where I was the victim of a bitter, estranged sister who stole my life savings to fund her big city business. The committee loved it. They said it made me relatable. It gave me a platform to talk about financial vulnerability and family betrayal. And I knew Mom and Dad would never question it. Because they always expect Maya to be the bad guy anyway." The words hung in the warm, food-scented air of the dining room, heavy and toxic. My mother slowly pulled her hand back from Clara's side of the table, her fingers trembling as she placed them over her mouth. My father looked down at his plate, his face turning an ash-gray color. The righteous anger that had filled him all afternoon seemed to leak out of him, leaving behind an old, broken man who realized he had been weaponized against his own child. Robert calmly closed the manila folder and placed it back into his briefcase. He clicked the latches shut again, the sound once more acting as a punctuation mark to the scene. "Now that the facts are established," Robert said, looking around the table, "we need to discuss the legal and professional ramifications of what has transpired here today." The dining room remained perfectly still, the silence heavy with the weight of shattered illusions. Nobody touched their food. The turkey sat cold in the center of the table, a stark contrast to the volatile emotional wreckage surrounding it. Robert placed both hands flat on his briefcase, leaning slightly forward. His presence was entirely commanding, reducing the family dining room to a court of law. "Let us be entirely clear about the legal landscape here," Robert began, his voice cutting through the stifling air. "What Clara has done constitutes identity theft, bank fraud, and a deliberate attempt to frame another individual for a felony. The bank's fraud division is already compiling this data. If Maya chooses to file a formal report, the state committee will be the very least of Clara's concerns. She will be facing federal indictments before the new year." Clara shrank back into her chair, the defiant fire that had flared up moments ago evaporating instantly. She looked at our mother, then her father, searching for the protective shield they had provided her entire life, but for the first time, neither of them moved to defend her. Maya, my father said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. He didn't look up from the table. His hands were flat on the wood, trembling slightly. Please. We can handle this. We can fix this within the family. Handle it how, Dad? I asked. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made Uncle David look down at his lap. The same way you handled it 2 hours ago, by cornering me, threatening me, and trying to force me to sign away my life's work based on a lie you didn't care to investigate. We didn't know, my mother stammered, tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. Clara seemed so distraught. She's always been so delicate, Maya, you have to understand. No, I don't, I interrupted, cutting her off cleanly. She isn't delicate, she's calculated. And the only reason you believed her is because it fit the story you've been telling yourselves about me for a decade. You wanted me to be the greedy, detached daughter who abandoned the family, because that made it easier for you to justify why you poured everything into her. I stood up from my chair. The movement was slow, deliberate. Robert stood up with me, picking up his briefcase with an effortless, professional grace. I didn't come here today to beg for your forgiveness or your understanding, I said, looking down at my parents. I brought Robert because I knew exactly what kind of trap had been set for me. I wanted the entire family to see the truth in broad daylight, so that the next time you whisper about me behind my back, you have to look at these certified bank statements first. I looked across the table at Clara. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, genuine panic. The political campaign was over before it had even begun. The state committee would drop her the second they realized her tragic origin story was a liability built on forgery. As for your campaign, Clara, I said coldly, I won't need to file a police report. Robert has already sent over the certified forensic documents to the compliance officer of the state primary committee, along with a formal cease and desist regarding any public mention of my name or my firm. Your political career is dead. Consider that the cost of my silence. Clara let out a sharp, strangled sob, but she didn't look up. My father finally raised his eyes, looking at me with a profound, hollow desperation. Maya, please. Don't leave like this. It's Thanksgiving. Let us make this right. You can't make this right, Dad, I said, picking up my purse from the adjacent chair. Because to make it right, you would have to understand what you actually did wrong. You didn't just believe a lie, you welcomed it. You were thrilled to have a reason to hate me. I turned away from the table, not waiting for a response, and walked out of the dining room. Robert followed a step behind me, his measured pace a reassuring rhythm against the hardwood. The air in the hallway felt entirely different now, clearer, lighter, stripped of the suffocating pressure that had greeted me at the door. I grabbed my coat from the banister and slid it on, pulling my car keys from the pocket. My mother hurried out of the dining room, stopping at the edge of the foyer. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of her righteous anger, her hands clutching at the fabric of her apron. Will we see you for Christmas? She whispered, her voice cracking. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. I looked back at her at the house that had shaped so much of my early life and realized I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no resentment, no lingering desire to prove my worth to them. The truth had set me free, but it had also severed the final, fraying cord connecting me to this place. No, Alina, I said, using her first name for the very first time in my life. You won't. I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp, biting afternoon air. The sky was an unbroken sheet of pale blue, and the wind felt clean against my face. Robert walked with me down the driveway, the gravel crunching under our boots. Are you okay? He asked quietly as we reached our cars. I'm better than okay, I said, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. I looked back at the house one last time. The curtains in the living room twitched, but nobody came to the window. For the first time in my life, I don't owe them a single thing. I got into my car, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway, leaving the house, the family, and the lie entirely in my rearview mirror.